All right. First rule of this channel, we not talk about this channel. Second rule of this channel, this is not legal advice. So this is going to be the 2024 offseason preview for the Indianapolis Colts. This one's been kind of difficult to break down. A lot of stuff that goes on in my head that doesn't translate well to doing a video, and I hate recording stuff over and over again. So anyway, the moral of the story is be careful about drafting guys at the edge of their range of outcomes, i.e., their ceilings. And sometimes that can burn you. And at other times you just really have no choice. And I'll bring up the rankings. Like if I want Christian McCaffrey, I have to draft him at his ceiling. That's just how it goes. Normally, like the way I like to look at it, rounds 1 through 3, I will be a slave to ADP. Like 4 and 5, I will get a little bit risky. And then outside of round 5, I really just don't care anymore. I just want to go up and get my guys, and I don't really care, if I leave a little bit on the table because again, I want the ability to have that upside. No one would have remembered Puka last year if he didn't do what he did and he was not being drafted. And there's a lot of guys out there where that thought process, that story just doesn't hit, and they end up being like 13th round flyers that no one talks about. So just remember that in general when we talk about the Colts, because Anthony Richardson is going on Fantasy Pros. He's going quarterback 650 overall, and then on ESPN he is going down here 63 overall, quarterback 7. I have him quarterback 8. That's where I think he is appropriately valued because there's a lot of risk involved with Anthony Richardson, and drafting him too high, the road for him to get to this elite type of tier, and hopefully I can pull up the right one. The road for him to get to this elite or a legendary type season, this Josh Allen, like 4,300 yards passing, 29, we'll just say 30 touchdown passes, and then another 15 rushing touchdowns. Remember that versus 524 yards rushing. That's what Anthony Richardson is going to be able to have to hit to have an elite outcome. Then after that, we're starting to talk about like this Lamar Jackson type of season where you're looking at somewhere along the lines of like 40 combined touchdowns to really start to talk about like a legendary season, and how unlikely it is for anybody to get that, let alone like overdrafting guys when they are generally lottery tickets. So to talk about this first, I will get into the tight end room, and there's an actual reason why I have to start with the tight end. So last year, combined with the Colts, the tight end rooms had 883 yards and 6 touchdowns. Now, the apples to oranges conversation, or apples to apples conversation, there's a reason why it's really bad in fantasy. It's just generally not how math works. And trying to predict the future, trying to use the variables that occurred last year is generally a bad idea. Even though the best predictor of the future is always the past behavior. But in this case, trying to expect that we're going to have a Gardner Minshew season with Anthony Richardson at the helm is not going to be a good idea. But first and foremost, Jelani Woods, he is a third round draft pick from 2022, and he was IR'd last year. He's probably the best bet to have a fantasy relevance from a Colt. Now, Mo Alley Cox, he is 31, I think, this year. I think he's going to most likely get cut. They owe him $5.9 million, and they're going to have like Drew Ogletree, Will Mallory, and then Kylan Granson. Mallory's probably more of the receiving tight end, and then Ogletree and Granson were the guys that were vying for the snap share last year. So Granson finished at like 60% last year. There was a couple games where it looked like Ogletree was going to take overall, but I imagine Jelani Woods is going to come in and maybe steal this, like with the third round or third year breakout 4.640 guy. He's got the measurables. That's what I'm going to be thinking. But remember, 883 yards, 6 touchdowns in this room. Now, the reason why I bring this up as we move over to the wide receiver room is Michael Pittman last year finished with about 1,200 yards. And again, I say about because he is generally going. I have him at wide receiver 15. Fantasy Pros has him at wide receiver 16, 29 overall. That's about where I think he should be valued. ESPN, again, drafting guys at the ceiling of their range of outcomes. Michael Pittman is wide receiver 11. I moved him down from wide receiver 10 because of the Adonai Mitchell pick in the second round. Now, Michael Pittman going wide receiver 11, 19 overall is going to have a very difficult road for him to jump up into the next tier of guys to potentially be a top 10 wide receiver. that's not just on yards. He's got to get those touchdowns too. And that may not necessarily be his role in the offense. So moving on from that, we're looking at like Josh Downs having that second year breakout. Last year, he did 771 yards on 98 targets, 68 receptions, 2 touchdowns. Now, again, it's not just going to be if he has about 230 more yards to hit 1,000 yards receiving. He's going to have to get like somewhere between like 4 and 5 receiving touchdowns for it to really matter. Now, I think he's generally appropriately cost or priced out. I have him 53 overall. He's going 55 on Fantasy Pros, 134. Again, right there on the range of potentially being able to be a viable wide receiver 3. On ESPN, he's actually going a little bit better at wide receiver 184. So again, I definitely think this would be a good value to throw at a guy that probably is likely to be flirting with 1,000 yards receiving. It's going to be his lack of touchdowns that's going to bother me. Those are less predictive. All right. And then the last two guys to talk about in this is going to be Alec Pierce, who is we'll talk about like that big X. That's what he plays, 4.5, 4.4, 140 guy. Third year coming up. He did last year, remember, Gardner Minshew and then Anthony Richardson played, 4 games, but only really played 2 full games. So Alec Pierce had 514 yards. Now, why we have to talk about Alec Pierce is Adonai Mitchell plays the same type of position that Alec Pierce is going to play within the offense. So the expectation is either that Mitchell is going to beat out Pierce at the start of the season, or he's going to see like basically what Rashid Rice did and slowly but surely eat into this and finish as the starting wide receiver for the Colts, be that deep threat, big play, Gabe Davis type of guy. Now, I bring this up because if Alec Pierce had 500 yards last year, if Adonai Mitchell has 500 yards, it's a bust. Like I think we could all agree on that. So combined with between these two guys, we're probably looking at about 1,000 yards receiving and like 7 touchdowns. That's what I would guess between these guys. Maybe we could get a little bit more out of Michael Pittman when it comes to the receiving touchdown department. We could push him up to 7. That would potentially just without having to go too much more than like 1,200 yards and 7 touchdowns. That would allow him to theoretically flirt with being a top 10 wide receiver. Again, apples to apples. If the receiving core in the league stays the same. And remember, we had like the wonkiness of Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase last year. So remember all this. So if we go 1,200 yards to Michael Pittman, we go 1,000 yards to Josh Downs because he takes that second year jump. And then we give 1,000 yards to Adonai Mitchell and Alec Pierce. That's 3,200 yards. Remember, last year, just from the tight end room, this is why I brought up the tight end room, we add that 883 yards, and I'll just say 800 yards from that tight end room to that group. Well, now we're talking about a 4,000-yard Anthony Richardson season, right? This is the problem with drafting guys at the edge of their range of outcomes, or even projecting that everybody takes a step forward, because now we have a 4,000 yards Anthony Richardson season. And I know what you're saying is, well, I don't see what the problem is with this, because we haven't even talked about the running room and for you, or the running back room, and for you to get your return on investment on a Jonathan Taylor, he's going to have to hit 300 to 400 yards receiving, design receiving work in this offense. Now, last year with him and Zach Moss, and I have this written down someplace, Zach Moss and Jonathan Taylor combined for about 350 carries, 1,500 yards, 12 touchdowns, and another 45 receptions, 345 yards, and 3 touchdowns. So you need that combined Zach Moss and Jonathan Taylor season to have Jonathan Taylor return on his investment. I have him at running back 6 overall. Let me see if I can pull this up someplace here. Jonathan Taylor is my running back 6. He's going 4 on Fantasy Pros, 12 overall. And it gets even worse when we look at ESPN. He's going running back 4, 9 overall. So remember, every rushing touchdown that Jonathan Taylor gets is not a rushing touchdown that Anthony Richardson is going to get. And every passing touchdown that Anthony Richardson has that doesn't go to Jonathan Taylor is a touchdown that Jonathan Taylor doesn't get. So remember, drafting players at the edge of their range of outcomes. If we're expecting the Colts this year to jump up into that 50 to 60 touchdown range, they are going to be a very good to elite type of offense. That's the type of jump that you would be looking at for everybody in the Colts offense to end up returning on that investment. And that's a very difficult thing where they're going in the draft. Now, I do like Anthony Richardson where he's going even in Fantasy Pros at 50 overall. because again, the same process of win me a league will lose me a league. I got to take a little bit of risk. He does have that ability. We'll talk a little bit more about him in a second. But it's just the idea that how difficult it's going to be for him to jump all the way up and compete with that Josh Allen type of season. If I could pull the right one up, the Josh Allen type of season that occurred last year for him to do that 23 points a game. And remember, my scoring settings and your scoring settings may be a little bit different, but that's how the receivers would have to break out. And if good old Jonathan Taylor doesn't get this receiving work, he's not going to return on investment going at like running back 6 to 4, something along those lines. He needs that receiving work to jump him up to that next level. Or you're looking at him potentially being like Miles Sanders in 2022, where he did 1,200 yards rushing, 11 touchdowns. And this is the type of year that we can pair together with Jalen Hurts going in 2022, where Jalen Hurts did have 13 rushing touchdowns. So we can have two guys have that high level of rushing work. But back to Miles Sanders, he only had 78 receiving yards. And so if we don't get that design type of passing work from Jonathan Taylor, he's still not going to get you there. And I'll talk about him here in a second also. So to break all this stuff down. So to look at this is Derrick Henry last year, he had 280 rush attempts. He led the league. Christian McCaffrey was 272. And I have written down here, Derrick Henry, he did 63% of the Titans carries, right? So again, the idea is Jonathan Taylor does 330 carries at 5 yards a clip. That's what you're that's what you're looking at for him to be able to return on investment. I actually have for him to do 1,600 yards, he has to do 300 carries at 5.4, and that's what he did in that legendary season that he had in 2021. So again, Derrick Henry did 4.2. Christian McCaffrey did 5.4 last year on his 272 carries, and that did, let me see if I 54% of the Niners carries. Now, Jalen Hurts here, last year, he did 557 carries. That led all quarterbacks. That was 30.7% of the Eagles carries. So now you're looking at like basically Anthony Richardson for you to have that idea for him to hit those elite or sub-elite type of rushing tiers. He's going to have to be like Jalen Hurts and combine basically every single carry, or well, almost all but 90 carries are going to have to go through Anthony Richardson or Jonathan Taylor, just to give you an idea. And then we're going to need Jonathan Taylor to have a ridiculous efficient season at like 5.4 yards per carry to return. That's the general idea. And that's without the distribution of rushing touchdowns between Anthony Richardson and Jonathan Taylor to go into this, right? This is how difficult it's going to be. So if Anthony Richardson, and I'm going to bet overall, like you're looking at like something like 600 yards rushing, 7 or 8 rushing touchdowns, that would be where my over under would be on Anthony Richardson, like 3,600 yards passing. I'll go as far as to say like 25 touchdowns. This is like a mean, and I'm expecting like the push at this level, the over underline with this guy. That something like that would only push Anthony Richardson, if I can pull the right one up, that would only put Anthony Richardson into this like sub elite tier, this about like 18, 19 points a game. Cause like when you look at Lamar Jackson, what he did, my over underline on Anthony Richardson is like 3,600 yards, 25 touchdowns, right? That's in line with Lamar Jackson, what he did last year. But it would be 600 less rushing yards. And then I'm expecting like 2 to 3 more rushing touchdowns than what Lamar Jackson did. And that's at 20 points. So, this is how razor thin you're going to have to get the production from all the players to return on all their investments. So if I believe it's an Anthony Richardson season, I probably would be betting against a Jonathan Taylor season. And again, where those touchdowns are going to go, maybe if I think it's going to be an Anthony Richardson season, I can bet on Michael Pittman, but I probably wouldn't be betting on Michael Pittman and Jonathan Taylor at the same time because there's only going to be so many touchdowns to go along in this offense. So the other thing to look at with Anthony Richardson, why he's so valuable, and I have this written down in my notes, if I can go hunt it down, is 1,000 yards passing is equal to 40 points, which is equal to 400 yard rushing. So 4,000 yard passer is equal to a 3,000 yard passer with 400 yards rushing. And I can actually go show you Russell Wilson doing 3,000 yards passing, 26 touchdowns. and 341 yards rushing and 3 rushing touchdowns, being more valuable than Matthew Stafford, who did 39 or basically 4,000 yards passing, 24 touchdowns. Did have more interceptions than Russ did, and Russ did have more passing touchdowns, but Matt Stafford only had 65 yards rushing. So again, that difference between these two guys, and they both missed about 2 games last year, right? Russ was still more valuable at 0.9 points a game, with about 1,000 yards difference in the passing game. So just remember that overall. And then we could look all the way down here at Justin Fields, and Justin Fields did miss 4 games last year. He did 17.7, and with him, he did 2,500 yards passing, 16 touchdowns, 9 interceptions to go along with 657 yards rushing, 4 rushing touchdowns. So, those rushing yards and those rushing touchdowns have so much more value than whatever we're going to be talking about in the passing game. So again, even if I think Anthony Richardson can get it done, it may be at the expense of potentially having a Michael Pittman breakout. So, I like 29 overall Michael Pittman to at least give me a push. 19 overall Michael Pittman. We're expecting the Colts to have the best offense in football, and that's going to be a lot harder for them to return on investment if I'm pushing these guys too high. Because yes, within the range of outcomes of Anthony Richardson is going to be a legendary season. It's also within his range of outcomes that he's, Justin Fields, Russell Wilson, and at that point, like, drafting him at quarterback like 5 or 6 is going to probably not win me a league, as opposed to, a Jaden Daniels who may put up the same stat line as Anthony Richardson, and he's going to go like 6 rounds deeper in the draft. That's just something to be keeping in mind with all of this. So going back to the next guys to talk about, like Jonathan Taylor, we already talked about the fact that him and Zach Moss last year did have what would be relatively considered, an elite type season with what they did. The other thing to be looking at is with how much Anthony Richardson is going to be able to produce. Jonathan Taylor is going to have to get like 2 or 3 rushing or receiving touchdowns, and that's one on top of him pushing close to 15 rushing touchdowns. So again, within Jonathan Taylor's range of outcomes is going to be this Miles Sanders season, which is 13th overall in 2022. But it's probably not going to be. It is going to be a disappointment if you're drafting your Jonathan Taylor shares in the first round of the draft and you get Miles Sanders from 2022. To be advised, because the biggest thing, and this is why I brought up with the tight ends, this 800, 900 yards and 6 touchdowns, like I would be very surprised that it just disappears entirely, right? And we still have to get a little bit of work out of the rest of the running back room, and that's why I have like Evan Hull pulled up. He's probably going to take some of the work away. He's last year's 5th round draft pick. He was IR'd last year. I definitely could see that he takes over the receiving back work, so Jonathan Taylor doesn't have to, be a Ferrari picking up blitzes in the pass game. The other thing to take into account, and we move over to the receivers, is there's still going to be a few other receivers that are going to get a little bit of work for the Colts. So like 100 or 200 yards between the rest of the wide receiver room and the running backs. So again, if everybody breaks a certain way, the wide receivers break all the right way, 3,200 yards, 800 yards from our tight ends. Jonathan Taylor gives us that 300 to 400 yards that we need for him to actually return on investment. And then another 200 yards from the rest of the offense. And again, we're looking at that point, something like a 4,600 yard Anthony Richardson season, if all the Colts return. That's on what we think that they're going to do this year. That's why I say, like, be very careful about pushing guys up. And sometimes you got to pull the trigger on that guy. Anthony Richardson is right there in that range of, you got to be a little gutsy to go get the guy if you think he's going to be able to return on that investment. I generally think that he is going to be somewhere around like 19 points a game. He was the highest guy when it came to points per drop back in fantasy last year. That's why I was so excited about him when I thought he was going to go somewhere between quarterback 12 and quarterback 9. Now that he's getting pushed all the way up there towards quarterback 6 overall, that scares me a lot more for him to be anything more than a middling level guy that he's becomes a punt at the capital that I put into him from a fantasy perspective overall. And that at that point, I would go a different direction for a guy that's going to be cheaper to give me the same range of outcomes or the same potential ceiling, I should say, overall. So I think that's it when I talked about all of the overall Colts. One last thing as I'm looking at my notes, that I would probably be talking about is how we're going to get to Anthony Richardson, where to his passing touchdowns, because again, last year we had 6 passing touchdowns from the the tight end room alone, and then we're expecting like three at least 3 receiving touchdowns from Jonathan Taylor. That's 9, and with about 24 to Anthony Richardson on the season. Again, I would be trying to look at a template of that Lamar Jackson season last year. That's what I guess we would be expecting from something along the lines for Anthony Richardson. So 14 touchdowns to come from like the wide receiver room at this point. And that's the wrong one. The wide receiver room. So like Michael Pittman is probably going to be really difficult for him to start flirting with the double digit touchdowns. It's going to be really difficult for him to take a step forward, like 2 or 3, especially if we're expecting Josh Downs to have that second year breakout, and then Adonai Mitchell to either take over that X role or eventually eat into Alec Pierce. So again, like 14 combined between these 4 guys, they're going to have relatively cap ceilings unless we're having that conversation about that Anthony Richardson massive breakout, which is definitely within his range of outcomes. This is the area that I don't like risking too much on guys this early in the draft, but at the same time, this is where I would think about that in this range. It is a very interesting conversation to have about wasting what would probably be like a 4th round draft pick on a guy that I could replace in like the 11th round of the draft. Just something to think about overall. That's what I was trying to break down with the Colts, and how some of these guys, in particular, like Michael Pittman and Jonathan Taylor, are probably slightly overvalued, and Anthony Richardson is somewhere between appropriately valued and undervalued, 63 overall, going into this draft. Just some general stuff to be thinking about. And who am I coming back with tomorrow? It's going to be the Redskins, and that's going to be really interesting because we're going to start breaking down Jaden Daniels tomorrow.